All right, well, thank you, Megan. We are really excited to be here today to talk with you about designing equity-focused projects using this specific example of the lessons that we have learned from the Growing Master Trainers project. And before I kind of jump into the presentation, I just wanted to say some really important thank yous. So first and foremost, I wanted to thank the Community Council. And this is the leadership group that has really been growing the project. I have learned so much from this group over the past 3-ish years and really deeply value the relationships that we have all forged together. Likewise, working with the OCCD team, in particular Kim Larson, and with Heidi McGowan, the project manager and facilitator, has really been a privilege. I have to say it's just a rare opportunity in my experience to work with such a great group of folks. Last but certainly not least, I also want to acknowledge the creativity and I almost want to say daring of the Early Childhood Funders Learning Circle in really supporting this very unusual project. I've reflected on this a lot, and to my mind, I feel like this is such a great example of where I would really like to see philanthropy sort of put more of their efforts. So I wanted to start by talking about the original project design. The pilot design has actually evolved quite a bit over time, which is kind of why we're here actually today, is to talk about the factors that have contributed to that evolution and how we can maybe apply those lessons learned to future projects. But what you see here in this kind of logic model is the thinking at the outset. In a nutshell, there were kind of two primary goals, and one was to increase the number of master trainers representing marginalized communities in Oregon, including communities of color, linguistically diverse communities, and rural and frontier communities. And then the second primary goal was to increase the number of culturally and linguistically responsive higher level trainings, so the Set 2 and Set 3 trainings. And the hope was that by doing so, by increasing the number of trainers and these higher level trainings, more marginalized child care providers would participate in professional development, hypothetically improving the quality of care provided, and then ultimately improving educational outcomes for children of color, linguistically diverse children, and children in rural and frontier areas. And the primary mechanism, as originally envisioned for bringing all of this about, was a mentorship model. So partnering kind of promising trainers with folks who had more experience in the field. A second sort of less clearly articulated goal at the outset was to examine the current system requirements and think about making recommendations for changes that would increase accessibility to underrepresented trainers. So a key part of the design was also the recruitment and creation of the Community Council. So this is a group of representatives of culturally specific organizations, largely in the Portland metro area, combined with folks representing several rural frontier CCR&Rs and one hub. Now, as an advisory group to the process, the role of this group was a little bit unclear at first, which is something that I will return to later. OCCD, the Oregon Center for Career Development, was contracted to lead the work, and an outside facilitator was brought in to facilitate the actual community council meetings. So this gives you an idea of where we kind of started out. I also wanted to talk just a little bit about my role as evaluator and how that has actually really evolved over time as well. So the original evaluation contract was pretty modest in scope and focused on two basic outcomes: this change in the number of master trainers and the change in the number of Set 2 and Set 3 trainings. I was, however, also invited at the outset to participate in the monthly community council meetings. And as a result of getting that kind of up close and personal view on the process, I pretty quickly realized that a more developmental approach would probably be more appropriate, along with a very explicit and intentional equity focus kind of woven all throughout the evaluation. So one of the first changes that I made to the evaluation design was a kind of rapid feedback mechanism for gauging engagement in and satisfaction with the community council process. And this mechanism has actually remained in place now over the course of the project, hopefully continuing to elevate voice, support accountability, and allow for timely adjustments. If anything has been sort of the rule in this project, it's just been iteration, right? It's just been a very iterative process. We've also invested a considerable amount of time and energy in several rounds of in-depth interviews with all sorts of project partners, in addition to collecting the more quantitative data that was called for in the original evaluation design. As other needs and requests for evaluation support have emerged from the Community Council, as well as from the project team, we have responded in kind. So again, it's been this real kind of just unfolding of trying to meet the needs of this, again, pretty unusual project. So what was going on in those early meetings that suggested to me that a developmental approach might be more appropriate? I've thought about this a lot, remembering how I felt when I first saw the initial project materials, and just remembering on paper how great the project looked. It had important equity-related goals. There seemed to be representation of culturally specific organizations, and they were bringing in what seemed to be a really innovative facilitation approach. So it seemed like a really exciting opportunity. In retrospect, I have come to realize that in large part of that was due right to my own position as a highly privileged, highly educated white person, bringing all of my own blind spots, faulty assumptions, and biases to the process. In either case, the proof, right, is in the pudding. And as the project unfolded in those early months, it really became clear that there actually were some fundamental problems with the initial approach. The community council meetings became pretty tense at times. The feedback on the meetings indicated a decent amount of confusion, frustration, sometimes just outright anger, and meeting attendance really started to drop off. So probably about 6 months into the process, the future of the project was kind of unclear. There was a lot of concern that the community council might just fade away. And indeed, there were some folks who did leave at that point. So that really brings me to the meat of this presentation, which is trying to unpack exactly what went wrong here, how it was repaired, and how to avoid going down the same path in the future as white dominant systems are really working toward becoming more equitable. So to better understand what was going on and hopefully inform an effective intervention, we conducted a series of in-depth interviews with the community council as well as with the project team. And what we heard, I have to say, was both really profound and unfortunately kind of ordinary, right? In that it told a story that is really very familiar to communities of color. I also want to acknowledge that although this feedback was pretty disappointing for the project team to hear, it really was such a gift from the community council. Folks could have easily walked, and as I said, some certainly did, and I, for one, would never fault them for having done that. But we so appreciate the generosity and the courage of those who did choose to hang in there and try again. So what did we hear in these interviews? For one, we heard a pretty fundamental frustration with the facilitation approach. And this was an approach that was actually imported from high tech and originally intended for designing smartphone apps. So on the face of it, maybe not a great fit. We also heard dissatisfaction with a facilitator who was neither familiar with childcare nor with the community-based organizations that were represented at the table, and who failed right off the bat to attend to power differentials within the group. there was really no explicit discussion or strategizing around equity concerns within the group itself. We also heard a sense that the council was being asked to advise on things that it seemed had already been determined. So folks asked really what was their role? Were they being asked to simply rubber stamp something that had already been determined? Similarly, we heard concerns that the problem itself had perhaps been misdiagnosed, since it was defined without input from the communities in question, and that in turn the remedy, in this case mentoring, might just be missing the mark. Folks repeatedly raised the concern that no childcare providers nor trainers representing the communities in question had been directly included in the needs assessment that was used to inform the initial design. So continuing with what we heard in the interviews, we also heard some pretty fundamental questions around how quality was being defined, both in terms of the assumptions around low quality care happening in marginalized communities and what high quality training might actually mean. So community council members asked if the term quality simply reflected white dominant norms and assumptions. Is there really one correct way to provide training or even to provide childcare? Folks likewise advocated very passionately for the strengths and skills of culturally specific trainers, providers, and families, a perspective that they felt had been largely overlooked in the original design. Finally, interviewees also talked about the dynamics within the group, within the community council, which was comprised of both BIPOC folks and white women who were already pretty deeply embedded within the mainstream system. So BIPOC folks reported often feeling unheard or disregarded by the white women, and the white women often expressed frustration in turn that their system expertise was not being utilized. So given all these factors that were identified, and it was a lot, it felt really big, we realized that this could have ended badly and simply reinforced the history of mistrust that many folks were already bringing into the pilot. However, in this case, there actually really is a happy ending. And what was different here, different in my own experience and different as reported by the community council members, was that project leadership really took this feedback to heart. In response, they made a number of pretty fundamental pivots that by all accounts salvaged the project and laid a strong foundation for a much more authentic process moving forward. So what exactly changed in the aftermath of these interviews? I have this sort of rainbow flower here. First, the funders got the message. They really listened. They threw their support, including, of course, financial, behind a number of mid-course corrections, including extending the overall project timeline to compensate for the delays caused by the initial missteps. The meeting facilitator was replaced and new project management brought on, both of whom were familiar with the system, highly responsive to feedback, and with strong commitments to equity. The project team made a very conscious decision to slow down and invest considerable time in repairing the damage and really building the relationships within the community council. This included participating in equity training together and a very conscious and articulated shift away from a deficit mindset toward a greater understanding of the many strengths of marginalized trainers, childcare providers, and communities. OCCD likewise redefined its role more clearly as supportive consultants to a process that would be led, so not advised, but led by the community council. And lastly, there was really a renewed emphasis on incorporating this real-time feedback that we were collecting from the community council to keep the process accountable by identifying and really working to address issues as they arose. So fundamentally, I think these pivots really empowered the community council to become the true design architects of the pilot and change the conversation around assimilation to the current system to one focused on system change. The original intervention mentoring was replaced by a number of other key strategies focused on making the system more accessible and responsive. And that kind of brings us up to the present. The Community Council has generated a number of recommendations for longer-term system change that will be presented to the Early Learning Division in the very near future. And a lot of people have asked me about whether or not I would be presenting these recommendations today, but that's really not the purpose of this presentation. And also, more importantly, I don't really think it's my role to do that. That rests with the Community Council as the true project leaders. So the next slide really brings us to the lessons learned. Kind of predictable mistakes that happen all too often and undermine the success of the many equity-focused initiatives that are going on all around us right now. As somebody that I showed this slide to earlier referred to these blue blobs as puddles, which I hadn't even thought of. I saw them as paint splatters, which I thought was funny about, we all bring our different perspectives. But I think a puddle one is a really good metaphor. As white dominant systems are really working to move toward becoming more equitable, these puddles, I think, are all around us, just waiting to be stepped in. And here I've just highlighted, I think, a few of the worst offenders. For example, right, we have this ubiquitous deficit-based thinking and an awful lot of implicit assumptions around what quality means that probably need to be unpacked. We need to recognize that it's not just neutral, universal science at play here, but white dominant values and structures that often get in the way. I would also argue that we need to stop centering white experts to define the problems and design the responses. So chances are good if we continue in that vein, right, that we will continue to step in these puddles. Likewise, we need to genuinely share power with so-called advisory groups. I think this is absolutely key to building trust and supporting authentic partnership. And in facilitating such groups, we need to be thoughtful about membership and the potential power differentials. Will there actually be space and support to elevate the voices of communities of color and other marginalized communities? Finally, I would say I've learned that we need to slow down and really invest that time in building real relationships. So there are so many historical harms in these spaces, and there just aren't any shortcuts to healing in the name of efficiency. And of course, we need to learn a whole lot more about what it means to authentically center equity all throughout the process. Something, right, that is just infinitely more easily said than done. So this is my kind of wacky slide here I wanted to leave us with at the end. These are some of the larger questions that have really come up for me in the course of working on this evaluation and continue to just bump around my head on almost a daily basis. And there's clearly not time to jump into each one of these, but I was hoping that you might take them away with you for further reflection and discussion with colleagues, maybe even beginning in the breakout rooms today. And I just wanted to say, that growing master trainers for me has been an incredible learning journey. And I am so grateful to have had the opportunity. It's really changed my perspective in some pretty fundamental ways. I think it's helped me become a whole lot better at my job and frankly helped me become kind of a better human being. So with that, I would actually like to hand it over now to Lupe and Mira, the two community council members who have graciously volunteered to share with us some of their own perspectives and insights into the GMT process. I have so much respect for these two women, and I'm really delighted that you have the opportunity to hear directly from them today.
If Mira's having trouble, I can go. Just bear with me on the background noise, and I have background things going on here too. So that's why I'm not turning on my video. Also, my internet gets pretty spotty when I have my video on. So that's why I declined the video. Thank you, Lorelai, so much for that brief overview of our time. And I say brief because we've been going at this for about 3 years as a community council. My name is Lupe Campos, and I work for Latino Network that is based here in Portland, Oregon. And I am the Associate Director of Preschool Programs. So I started with this program back when they first put the community council together. However, before we started as a community council, as Lorelai had mentioned, there was already this predetermined way of doing this project, and a way that was determined without the culturally specific organizations from the community council as part of it. Mainly, from my understanding, was a bunch of people from the dominant culture, white culture, around the table, putting this project together, and then bringing it to us for us to advise on, as Lorelai mentioned in her slides. So I was one of the ones that was very frustrated, didn't feel heard, was like, why am I here? What's the point? What is my role here? And in hearing the presentation by Shannon, which I is great to the work that is being done to drive towards equity, but I also heard that of those samples taken, 85% of the kids were white. I heard a lot about trauma informed. I did hear mention of the historical trauma of racism and everything, but honestly, what this project in GMT lacked at the beginning, it wasn't fully understood. And also other projects that I hear when wanting to bring more diversity and equity to the work and to the field, I don't hear the word cultural humility a lot. And that is very important in this work that is being done to drive towards equity, because everyone has to recognize their own biases, and when it comes to race and culture, and recognize that just because you know certain stuff about a certain culture doesn't mean you know it all, and that every person in the culture are individuals, so they might not even identify fully with the knowledge of their culture that you have, right? I say that, for example, because a lot of times in my life, people have assumed I'm Catholic because I'm Latina. And they put that assumption on me, and they get frustrated when I say no. And they're like, because they believe it to be true, but you're Latina, and most Mexicans or Latinos are Catholic, right? No. Just because the majority does not mean that all are, right? We're individual people, as well as having our culture. And it also, different people identify differently within their own culture as well. So that's something that, like, with these projects, or as I am part of advisory committees or committees that are inviting me, a person of color, into the table to drive towards change or to get my opinion. I mean, that's like where the tokenism that Lorelai is talking about, that is something that we always question when we're asked. So it's something that we always say, like, do we want to be a part of this? Because is it just to say, oh, we have a brown person here? Just to say that we got them in here, and they informed. But truly, are you really putting that at the forefront? And that's what in this GMT, at the beginning, it wasn't, until until the process, and until Lorelai really conducting those in focus interviews with us midway through. She was like, whoa, I'm hearing this over and over again. And then that's when a drive to change the dynamic of GMT happened. And we got new facilitators, and we got new people at the table from different organizations as well. And then that's when we started to make progress. And the one thing that my thing that I always say is, like, when things get put together, they get to put together, like what Laura was saying in the white dominant idea of quality, right? The idea of quality to the dominant culture, and that it isn't the same thing in all cultures. And so I start to wonder things like this group, the childcare resource group. I'm looking at those that are on video, and I'm not seeing people of color, and I know about this project that is called the Oregon Child Care Project, and it is made up of about 9 organizations that are culturally specific and equity focused. 6. It's a coalition of 6 progressive race and gender justice nonprofit organizations working to build a comprehensive childcare system in Oregon. So my wonder is this group connected to that group? Because if you're really wanting to work towards that change, do that research in an equitable way, this group of the Oregon Child Care Coalition should be a part of that. Should be a part of that research, should be a part of designing that professional development for early childhood, should be a part of all that. So you can get the perspective also in different cultures. What does PD mean to you? What does it look like to you? And that's something that in this project is a come away for me as well, and grateful that there was change that happened, that our voices were heard. Because at the beginning, I was one of the ones that I felt was somebody in the project, a white person. She responded a certain way to something I said, and I felt attacked. I felt like what I said was not validated, that it didn't matter, that there was excuses. And that was something like, the only reason I kept going to that is because, they gave us the contract, we already signed, let me do. And also, I'm not a person that quits. But that's my biggest thing to say here is that if things are getting put together to drive towards equity, the saying that at the forefront also is the communities of color, we want them to thrive. We want to bring equity into services that we're providing for them. Then the PAC, Parent Accountability Council, that's just part of the governing body of our early learning help hub here in Multnomah, one of their guiding principles is nothing done for us without us. So nothing put together without the opinions of those that you're trying to say, this is going to help you, this is going to serve you, this is going to help you thrive. Okay, were there voices in there? Did they say what they needed to thrive? So that is the main thing when it comes to these type of projects, that when you're trying to drive towards that systematic change, is thinking about that. How are we doing that? Are we including the voices of those that need the systematic change for all to thrive? And that's all, and I'll pass it on to Mira.
Part of it was that halfway through, I really wanted to back off and not continue with the project. I'm from Neighborhood House, and we are a community-based organization. We are not culturally specific, and we actually are more culturally agile. So we brought a different perspective to the council. And it was very exciting because we do have 2 active networks of in-home childcare providers. However, when we started, one of the biggest gaps that evolved, and that was really pretty apparent, was that the outcomes had already been set without input from childcare providers who we termed as marginalized, and there was no evidence of any representation from them. Halfway through, there was a course correction, and and what was very attractive was the diverse leaders on the council. There was community organizations, culturally specific organizations, and all the educational institutes. However, there was a lot of discrepancy in our perspectives, and we were just not coming together. One of the challenges was that the pilot project was so cramped initially. We needed to finish this work in a year, then it was extended. And my experience with pilot projects has always been that we need to step back, sit back, nurture what we have, reevaluate over and over again. And none of this would have been possible if Lorelei hadn't been intentional, committed, and had a holistic perspective on the evaluation piece. Every step of the way, she changed course in evaluation techniques. I worked with a number of researchers, and she brought such a fresh perspective in listening, intentional interviewing our childcare providers, our network coordinators, and even changing the format of collecting data. It wasn't stringent. It was both a narrative as well as surveys, but her interpretation and her constant communication was, I think, what has taken this project to this level. The other piece was having a training, walking the bumpy road with everybody and then meeting them, and looping back to what was our original thought behind this. We wanted to include, as Lupe said, all the marginalized in-home childcare providers, but are we making an effort to reach out to them, or are we imposing our assumptions on them? So I've been really excited about it now. We have a number of participants who are going to be graduating and expanding their businesses and mentoring others to join the project. And I have to say that if it wasn't the dedication of the team, PSU and Kim and all the community participants, and also having the consistency midway when people left and filtered off, and then we had a core group where we could air our concerns, express our frustrations, and build that relationship. So as Lorelei said, it was extremely basic. It was all about building relationships. And that's what early childhood is all about. Thank you. And I'm so sorry for all the bumps I've had with technology today.